Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a pretty big one, the financial risks of climate change to the U.S. federal government.
It's a big one, yeah.
We're basing this deep dive on a white paper from December 2024, and we've got a ton of other sources to pull from, like agency reports, economic analyses, you name it. We even have some real-world examples.
That's right. We're going to try and give you the full picture, not just the doom and gloom.
Exactly, and I think the most important question here is, how much could climate change end up costing the government and, by extension, taxpayers like you?
Yeah, that's the big question. It's not just about polar bears anymore, Climate change is hitting our wallets.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The white paper states that climate change is already costing the U.S. close to $150 billion each year.
Yeah, and even that's probably a low estimate.
Really? Why is that?
Well, that 150 billion mainly covers direct economic losses, stuff like property damage from hurricanes, floods, wildfires, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I see. So it's not taking into account all the indirect costs.
Exactly. Those are a lot harder to put a number on, but they could be even bigger.
Like what, for example?
Well, you've got long-term healthcare costs for people injured in these disasters. And you can't forget about disruptions to businesses, to supply chains. And then there's the value of ecosystems that are damaged, which is really tough to quantify. It all adds up really fast.
So it's not just about the initial shock of a hurricane or wildfire. It's that ripple effect that just keeps going.
Exactly. And then on top of that, we're seeing these events become both more frequent and more destructive. The report calls it an intensifying threat.
Intensifying threat. So in the 1980s, we saw a billion-dollar disaster every 4 months, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. But now it's almost every 3 weeks.
Wow. Okay, so what's making these events so much worse?
The report talks about something called compound events.
Compound events.
Yeah, it's like, when a bunch of different climate hazards sort of collide?
Right. Okay.
So, the report mentions a wildfire near the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Colorado, and it spread really fast because of dry conditions, strong winds, and no snowpack. And each of these things has been made worse by climate change.
So it all came together to create a much bigger, much more destructive fire.
Exactly.
And I imagine we see the same kind of pattern with hurricanes, right? With warmer ocean temperatures.
Yeah, definitely. And coastal flooding with rising sea levels.
Yeah.
And droughts that make those wildfires more severe. And more widespread.
Okay, so we've got this intensifying threat. We've got these rising costs. What does it all mean for the government's budget and for our wallets?
Well, the report breaks the financial impact down into 3 main categories. You've got lost revenue, increased program costs, and damaged infrastructure. And each one of these directly affects government spending.
And that means it affects taxpayers too, right?
Right.
Okay, so let's dive into these one by one. Let's start with increased program costs. The report specifically talks about the USDA's Federal Crop Insurance Program.
Yeah, the Federal Crop Insurance Program. It focuses on one specific plan, the Pasture, Rangeland, and Forage Insurance Plan, or PRF for short.
Okay, so this PRF plan basically protects ranchers from losing money because of a lack of rain.
Yeah, lack of precipitation, but as climate change messes with those rainfall patterns, more and more ranchers need to use that insurance.
And that's where things get expensive.
Right.
The report mentions that the government might have to pay anywhere from like $495 million to $2.6 billion per year by 2050, just for these claims.
Yeah, that's a huge jump.
It is. And the report says the higher end of that range, that's if everyone in the PRF program needs to use it.
Which is totally possible, given how often we're seeing droughts and extreme weather.
So what happens if more and more farmers have to rely on this? Does the government just write a bigger check?
I mean, it's not that simple. If those
Well,
insurance payouts go up, it could lead to higher food prices, right?
For everyone.
Yeah, for consumers. And that could affect the entire economy.
Wow, so it's a chain reaction.
Yeah, sort of. It could mean the government has to spend more on things like food assistance programs. It's all connected.
Okay, so we've got this domino effect on food prices. What about the actual physical damage to, like, government buildings and infrastructure?
Yeah, the report talks about that, too. The EPA, for example, has done these really detailed climate resilience assessments for their own facilities across the country.
And what did they find?
Well, the projections are kind of scary.
Yeah.
Take the Gulf Breeze facility in Florida. They think that capital improvement costs could reach $142.6 million by 2034.
Wow, and that's just to keep things as they are, right? What if they need to make bigger changes or rebuild things entirely?
Oh, that's way more expensive. Like, they're projecting $99.6 million for new construction and $114.6 million for possible catastrophic rebuilds.
Because of climate change.
Yeah.
So even if a hurricane doesn't completely destroy the facility, just the extra wear and tear from more storms, from flooding, from all of it,
Yeah.
it's going to cost a lot of money.
Exactly. And, all of those figures, those are in 2024 dollars. So the actual costs, they'll probably be even higher because of inflation.
Right, right. Okay, and this is just one facility. How big of a problem is this, really?
Oh, it's not just one facility. That's just a tiny, tiny fraction of the EPA's total infrastructure. They have facilities everywhere, and many of them are vulnerable to the same kinds of risks.
And isn't it true that something like 60% of Superfund sites are also at risk from climate change?
Yeah, Superfund sites, so those areas that are already contaminated, they need really costly cleanups. And now climate change is making things even more complicated and expensive.
Okay, so this vulnerability, it goes beyond just active EPA facilities.
Exactly. And, we've only just started to scratch the surface here. The report also goes into the risks faced by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD.
Okay, let's talk about that. I know the report mentions how climate disasters, especially flooding, can lead to more claims on HUD-backed loans.
That's right. So as property values go down because of things like, repeated flooding, people might not be able to pay their loans.
And then HUD has to cover the losses.
Exactly.
So it's not just about physical damage, it's about the whole housing market.
Right. The report actually uses the example of the FHA's multifamily and healthcare loan portfolios. They're especially vulnerable, with projections showing a potential increase of 15.7% on top of the regular natural disaster risk.
So that could have a huge impact on the FHA's bottom line.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like we're just getting started here. Is this report just like a list of ways the government's going to have to spend more money because of climate change?
Well, kind of. These examples are just, a small taste of the financial risks that are out there. The white paper goes into a lot more detail about other agencies and programs that are facing similar challenges.
So it's not just a few billion here and there. It's systemic. It's going to affect everything: how we grow our food, how we maintain our infrastructure, how we keep our housing market stable.
That's a good way to put it. Climate change is a threat multiplier. It impacts pretty much every aspect of government spending and government operations.
And all of those costs eventually trickle down to us, the taxpayers.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to understand these risks and start thinking about solutions.
Okay, I think that's a good place to take a break. When we come back, we'll explore some of the potential solutions to mitigate these financial risks from climate change. All right, so in the first part of this deep dive, we talked about the pretty serious financial risks of climate change to the U.S. government and, by extension, to taxpayers like you. It's a lot to take in, I know, but the good news is that the white paper doesn't just lay out problems, it also explores some potential solutions.
Right. And one of the most important approaches they talk about is the development of climate adaptation plans, or CAPs, by different federal agencies.
CAPs. Okay. So what are these plans exactly?
Well, think of them as like practical roadmaps for these agencies to figure out, okay, how is climate change going to affect us and what are we going to do about it? It's about being proactive instead of just reacting to disasters after they happen.
So it's like having a plan for a rainy day, but like a really, really big rainy day.
Exactly. And in June 2024, 24 federal agencies actually released updated CKs covering the years 2024 to 2027. And what's interesting is that these plans are getting much more sophisticated, like they're being integrated into the core functions of these agencies.
Meaning like how they do their jobs, how they operate every day, how they manage their buildings and equipment and stuff.
Right, exactly. And it's not just happening randomly, The report says there's a whole bunch of factors pushing this change,
Like what?
like presidential directives, congressional mandates, even internal agency initiatives. There's the Disaster Resiliency Planning Act, for example.
So it's coming from the top down and the bottom up. Everyone's starting to realize that we need to adapt to this changing climate.
Right. There's this growing awareness that climate change is a real threat and we need to be proactive.
Okay, so these DFPs are in place. Can you give me an example of how one of these agencies is actually using their plan?
Sure. The Department of the Interior, they've created this really cool tool called the System for Hazard Identification, risk assessment, and adaptation.
Okay, that's a mouthful. Can we just call it Shake-IRA?
Yeah, IRA. It's basically like a prime example of how we can use technology to understand these risks and then manage them.
So what does it do?
It lets interior staff look at maps of their assets, like their buildings, their parks, their equipment, and they can overlay climate projections on top of those maps.
So what kind of climate projections are we talking about here?
Everything: sea level rise, wildfire risk, changes in rainfall patterns.
Wow. So they can see which areas are most at risk and then make smarter decisions about things like maintenance or when to invest in upgrades or even when to move a facility entirely.
Exactly. It helps them anticipate problems and avoid those costs we talked about earlier.
So it's like a crystal ball, but for climate change.
They're pretty much. And the report highlights how Shira is already being used for a whole bunch of things, like managing hazardous materials, protecting cultural resources, figuring out where to focus conservation efforts.
So it's not just about protecting buildings, it's about making sure they can keep doing their jobs in a changing climate.
Exactly. And another agency that's taking this seriously is the Department of Transportation, DOT.
Yeah.
They're responsible for the whole transportation system, which is really vulnerable to climate change.
All those roads, bridges, airports, right?
Yeah, a huge network, and it's essential to our economy and, just getting around. And DOT, they've developed a whole bunch of tools to assess those climate risks
Right.
and make that infrastructure more resilient.
And one of those tools is called CHER, right?
Yep, the Climate Hazard Exposure and Resilience Tool.
Lots of acronyms today.
Yeah.
Okay, so what makes CH special?
It's similar to Shia in that it uses data to analyze climate risks, but it focuses specifically on transportation assets like roads, bridges, airports. And it takes things a step further by projecting into the future.
How?
They use data from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to see how climate change might affect those assets over the next few decades.
So they're not just looking at what's happening now, they're looking at what could happen 10, 20, 50 years from now.
Yeah, which is super important for planning. They can figure out which roads are likely to flood during a hurricane and then prioritize those for upgrades or even relocate them.
So again, it's about being proactive and making those investments now to avoid bigger problems later. And the report does mention some pretty worrying statistics about how climate change could impact the transportation system.
Right. Like they say, even a 10% increase in hurricane wind speed could cause a 20% increase in road closures and a 30% increase in economic losses.
Wow. That's a pretty strong argument for investing in resilience.
Yeah, no kidding.
So how is DOT addressing these risks? What are they investing in?
A lot of things. Upgrading infrastructure, providing technical assistance to state and local governments, and giving out emergency relief funding.
Right, and then there's that PROTECT program, right?
The Promoting Resilient Operations for a Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation Program, or PROTECT.
Okay, that's a mouthful. So PROTECT basically provides funding for projects that will make our transportation system more resilient.
Yeah, through formula funding and discretionary grants.
So it seems like they're trying to cover all the bases.
Yeah.
But with all this investment, how do we know we're getting the most bang for our buck?
Well, that's where benefit cost analysis comes in, or BCA. It's a way to really look at the costs and benefits of these projects, like how much does it cost to elevate a roadway versus how much would it cost if that roadway flooded and had to be repaired or replaced.
So it's not just about spending money, it's about spending it wisely.
Exactly. And the report actually gives some good examples of how BCA has been used effectively. Like, there's this study by the National Institute of Building Sciences. They found that elevating structures just 1 foot above the base flood elevation can have a benefit to cost ratio of 6-to-1.
So for every dollar you spend, you save $6 in potential future costs. That's a pretty good deal.
Yeah, it shows that even small investments in resilience can make a big difference.
Okay, so we've got these caps, we've got tools like Shira and Share, we've got programs like PROTECT, and we're using BCA to make sure those investments are smart. What else can we do to address the financial risks of climate change?
Well, besides adaptation, the report also talks about this interesting concept called the social cost of greenhouse gases.
Social cost of greenhouse gases, that sounds complicated.
It is a bit complex, but basically it's about putting a dollar value on the harm caused by climate change. Like, how much does each ton of greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere cost society in terms of damages and lost opportunities?
Okay, so if we could put a price tag on that pollution, it can help us make better decisions about how to reduce it.
Right. It's called the social cost of greenhouse gases, or SEGHG, and the EPA uses it to estimate that monetary damage. And that information can be used to evaluate different climate policies.
So it helps us understand the financial benefits of reducing those emissions.
Exactly.
So by understanding the true cost of climate change, including that social cost, we can make smarter decisions about mitigation and adaptation.
Exactly. And the report actually looks at the climate benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which was passed in 2022.
The IRA, it had all those provisions about reducing emissions, right?
Yeah.
Like tax credits for electric cars and investments in renewable energy.
Exactly. And the report estimates that the financial benefits from just the CO2 reductions alone, those could be in the hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of dollars over the next few decades.
Wow. And I bet those are just the benefits from reducing CO2. What about the other positive impacts from the IRA?
The report talks about a bunch of other things like better air quality, lower healthcare costs, even new jobs in the clean energy sector.
So it's not just about avoiding costs, it's about potential economic gains from investing in these climate solutions.
Exactly.
It sounds a lot more hopeful than what we were talking about before.
It is. Investing in climate solutions is good for the environment and good for the economy.
So we've talked about the risks, the potential solutions, and the investments being made. It seems like the government is doing some good things to address this. But is it enough?
That's a good question, and the report tackles that head on. They talk about how the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, plays a crucial role in making sure agencies are actually managing these risks and implementing their CAPs.
The GAO, that's the government watchdog, right? So what are they doing in this case?
They've published a bunch of reports that look at both the progress that's been made and the areas where we need to do better. Like, one of their main recommendations is for agencies to come up with more accurate financial models.
To really get a handle on how much climate change is actually going to cost.
Right. Because that information is crucial for making smart decisions about where to put resources and how to prioritize those investments.
I know the report also mentions the need for better coordination between different agencies.
Absolutely. Climate change is a complex problem, and it doesn't fit neatly into those traditional government silos. We need all the agencies working together, sharing information, and using resources effectively.
It makes sense. You can't expect the EPA to handle this all on their own.
Right. And it's not just a federal issue either. The GAO says we need stronger partnerships with state and local governments and with the private sector, too.
So breaking down silos and working together.
Exactly. Climate change is a global challenge, and we need everyone working together to address it.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's take another break, and when we come back, we'll wrap things up with some key takeaways and final thoughts. All right, we're back for the last part of our deep dive into the financial risks of climate change to the U.S. federal government. We've talked about a lot, from rising costs to potential solutions, and even how different agencies are adapting. I think we're starting to get a sense of the big picture here.
Yeah, I think so too. And for me, the biggest takeaway is just how widespread this challenge really is. It's not just one agency or one program. Climate change affects every part of our economy: agriculture, infrastructure, housing, public health, you name it.
And the financial implications are, well, they're huge. The report projects that the cost to the federal government could reach billions, maybe even trillions of dollars in the coming decades.
And, ultimately, those costs get passed down to us, the taxpayers. That's why it's so important to understand these risks and be proactive.
So we need to invest more in both climate mitigation and adaptation.
Right. Yeah, we need both. Mitigation to reduce those emissions and tackle the root cause of the problem, and adaptation to adjust to the changes that are already happening and prepare for future impacts. We can't just do one or the other.
And it is good to see that there are some promising initiatives already in place. We talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, those climate adaptation plans, and some programs focused on resilience.
Right. But the report also makes it clear that, we need to do more. We need to invest more, strengthen our policies, and really foster a culture of innovation and collaboration across the board, in government and in the private sector.
And it's not just about spending money, right? It's about spending it wisely.
Exactly. The longer we wait to take action, the more extensive and disruptive it's going to be.
So it's not just about protecting our wallets. It's about protecting our communities, our economy, our future.
You got it. It's about building a future that is resilient, sustainable, and equitable for everyone.
Okay, so to bring it all back to you, the listener, what are the key takeaways?
Well, first of all, climate change, it's not just an environmental issue. It's an economic issue, it's a social issue, a national security issue. It affects all of us.
And those financial risks, they're serious. They're going to affect lots of government agencies, programs, different sectors of the economy, and they're only going to get worse if we don't do anything.
And while the government is taking steps to address these risks, we need to do more now.
Mhm.
We need to invest in both mitigation and adaptation, make our policies stronger, and really encourage collaboration at all levels.
And remember, addressing climate change, it's not just about avoiding costs, it's about finding opportunities. Opportunities to create jobs, to drive innovation, to protect public health, and build a more prosperous, sustainable future.
But the report mostly focuses on those financial risks, the numbers. What about the social and humanitarian costs of climate change? Those are much harder to measure.
It's true. Things like communities being displaced because of sea level rise, the health impacts of extreme heat and air pollution, the potential for social unrest after climate disasters, those are real consequences.
So how do we take this financial information and use it to motivate real action? How do we translate these economic risks into a sense of urgency, a call to action that addresses the wider impacts on society?
How do we make sure that we're not just responding to protect our wallets, but also to protect people and the planet?
That's something for all of us to think about. What resonated with you from this report? What does it mean for your community, your work, your life?
This deep dive, it's given us a glimpse into a very complex and challenging issue, but it's also shown us a path forward. By working together, we can build a future that is prosperous and sustainable.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.